possible that there would be, the Israelis made a lot of the fact that nobody seemed to cry a lot of tears for the Syrians when their reactor was destroyed by Israel in 2007. One of the geopolitics of the Middle East play out along a series of axes, right? On the one hand, there's a kind of there's Israel against the Muslim countries in the Middle East. On the other hand, there's also a Sunni-Shia struggle, which you can see playing out to some degree in places like Syria, in which, to some degree, in a kind of strange way, Israel is aligned with the Sunni powers because they are more modern in their views towards Israel than are Iran and Syria. On the double standard question, look, we live in a world of double standards. I mean, there are, Israel has a nuclear weapon. The United States has very large numbers of nuclear weapons. India has a nuclear weapon. Pakistan has a nuclear weapon. So I think that Barack Obama has laid out a vision in which he would like to get to an entire world without nuclear weapons. I think that's frankly very difficult to imagine because the genie of nuclear knowledge is out of the bottle. But I do think that some regimes are more dangerous with nuclear weapons than others. And while I don't believe that Iran has shown itself to be suicidal, I do think, given Iran's history of being deep connection with terrorism, it's one of the regimes that I would want least to get nuclear weapons. Whatever you want to say about the Israeli nuclear program has been around for a long time. It has not really produced a kind of spiraling of kind of regional nuclear arms race, which I think is more of a concern with an Iranian program. And so I think that there's no realistic scenario in which Israel is going to give up its nuclear weapons program. It wouldn't happen unless there were full peace with all of its neighbors and a warm peace that lasted for a long period of time. So I think that one has to be careful of not using the discussion of Israel's nuclear program as a way of essentially preventing us from taking the actions we need to take to, if they're going to be effective, to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon as well.
The discussion about Iran's nuclear program, ultimately it's not actually about Iran getting a bomb. It's about Iran having the capability to build a bomb. There's this phrase that's tossed around, which is virtual nuclear state. And that's really what we're talking about here. That's really the crux of this conversation. That can we live with an Iran that could potentially break out and build a bomb? And would that capability provide Iran with so much strategic vulnerability? Would it be able to basically empower Iran to counter Israel's strategic vulnerability in the region? And I really think that when you have folks like Ehud Barak talking about this isn't a matter of an existential threat, this is a matter of essentially, geostrategic balance of power issues between Iran and Israel, it's evident that this is really more of a question of Iran having this virtual capability, and what can we do to make sure that an enrichment capability isn't the same as being a virtual nuclear power. To the other issue, I mean, as far as Israel's nuclear program, I think that this is clearly not a realistic goal anytime soon to have Israel get rid of its nuclear weapons program. There is a conference in Helsinki that's coming up at the end of the year that is focused on a Middle East WMD-free zone, and I think it's a valuable conversation to have, given that there has been several polls inside of Israel in which Israelis have endorsed the idea of Israel giving up its nuclear program if Iran completely gives up its nuclear program. And so there does seem to be a domestic political receptivity to this idea. Again, I don't think that this is realistic in the long term, but it's certainly something that should be explored, and maybe someday when there is more political traction for this, I think that it would be beneficial. I think the goal of eradicating all nuclear weapons is one that we should be working on.
The next question actually builds on something you had said earlier, and I'm going to add to something Peter has said earlier. So the question is, how should we be interpreting the phrase "wipe Israel off the map," literally as in militarily or figuratively, as in politically, and can negotiations induce Iran to retract its military threat? And I think you could answer that independently, but it doesn't happen in a vacuum, because we're sort of invariably drawn back to this historical background, the psychology of the Holocaust that Peter was alluding to, which not only puts Jews or Israelis in a particular perspective of understanding this, but also those in the West who would say, you know what, people said the same thing in the 1930s, that this is just rhetoric, that the Nazis used their anti-Semitic rhetoric for domestic and other purposes, and they don't really mean to engage in it. And it's easy to dismiss that way. But people argue that one should learn from their historical mistakes and say, not again. Not to appease these guys again and simply say, well, it's rhetoric, and they don't really mean it. So if this phrase is out there of the intention to wipe Israel off the map, what does one do with it? Given this knowledge that we have of how that phrase is interpreted, not only inside Israel, but among the minds of many political leaders in the West, who, when you think about it historically, we're still not all that far removed from the Second World War.
I think there's a debate. I don't speak Persian, but there's a debate. There's a debate about what Ahmadinejad actually said. And some people, I think, claim that he was speaking about kind of Israel stopping to exist in the way that the former Soviet Union had stopped to exist kind of over time, rather than some kind of action by Iran doing it. But I think that others have countered that there are other, even if you don't believe that he exactly said wipe off the map, then other statements by Iranian figures, leaders that give you enough to be concerned about. I read something recently where they noted that in Iranian parades, this idea that Israel should wipe off the map is draped on banners over the Shahab's 3 missiles, and so it's understandable that people get very, very worried when they hear that. But I do think that the problem with the Hitler analogy is the problem with all historical analogies, is that historical analogizing is dangerous if taken out of context. There's never any one historical analogy that perfectly approximates the situation that you're facing today. And the Hitler analogy isn't one radical extreme, right? It is the radical extreme of the greatest kind of madman ever, essentially, to be in charge of a powerful country. There are other examples where you can find leaders who were also said bone-chillingly terrifying things, who didn't act the way Hitler did in terms of his aggression. One of them was Stalin. I mean, there's a great story about Hubert Humphrey when he was a senator going to meet Stalin, and he says, Stalin says, sorry, no, it wasn't even Stalin, it was Khrushchev. He went to meet Khrushchev, and Khrushchev says, where are you from? And Humphrey says, I'm from Minnesota. So Khrushchev shows me where that is on the map. So he shows him, and Khrushchev goes, good, we won't bomb there. It's important to remember that the United States made a decision to essentially sit back and watch Stalin and Mao get nuclear weapons, right? I mean, the Iranians, as horrific as they are pictures compared, sorry, a Jewish phrase, they're small potatoes, small fries, compared to these great mass murders. And so, I think the point I'm making is one needs to look at a regime's actual behavior. What we have with the Iranians is actually, we have a fair amount of data because the Islamic Revolution took place in 1979. So they've been in power for quite a fair amount of time. And so we can actually see how they've acted. And I don't think, one of the interesting things, just parenthetically, about Israel's relationship with Iran is that actually Israel was fairly sympathetic to the Islamic Republic in its early years. I mean, in the war between Iraq and Iran, when most of the world was on Iraq's side, Israel was actually more sympathetic towards Iran. You know, the Iran-Contra deal partly came about because Israel helped to broker this U.S. sale of weapons to Iran under Ronald Reagan. And that was at a time when Khomeini was in power, and arguably the regime was more ideologically fervent than it is today. I don't, based on, you know, I'm not an expert on Iranian foreign policy. Those people who I've read who are, all seem to make the point that you could point to several examples in which Iran has made pragmatic calculations based on the regime's desire to survive. For instance, ending the Iran-Iraq war, or being willing to stop enrichment in 2003 after the U.S. frightened the heck out of them with our invasion of Iraq. And I think if you look at its relationship with Hezbollah and Hamas, you've seen that desire not to be suicidal. So I think it's very important to bring that to bear and not only look at the rhetoric.
I think you summarized it pretty well. This is a fact that Iran, look, after the revolution, it was Khomeini who coined this phrase that Ahmadinejad loves to use about, you know, depending on the translation, wiping Israel off the map or erasing them from the page of history and so forth. This is not something that Ahmadinejad necessarily coined himself. This was Khomeini who first said this. And at the time, he was talking to the Israelis through back channels. We talk about the Osirak bombing. Iraq was in the middle of a war against Iran when Israel went in and took out that facility. This was something that they did, you know, as a, you know, that the Iranians certainly appreciated, if not helped facilitate. So when the revolution happened, Iran largely continued the foreign policy that it had under the Shah, in which it was potentially Israel's greatest ally in the region at the time, though on its face, it maintained this anti-Israel rhetoric. So I completely agree that you know, obviously it's not acceptable for this type of rhetoric to be used, but we have to respond to the actions and the reality of the threat and not allow that to color our decisions so that we're reacting in a way that's not rational and that doesn't actually address the real threat at hand.
Another subject, it's all close to the same thing, but Mitt Romney said in the primaries that he was talking tough about Iran, suggesting you know, that he wouldn't be opposed to war. You can argue that Obama said the same thing when you don't take military threat off the table, but so maybe try to analyze it through the lens of Republican politics as opposed to simply national politics. Is he serious? You know, are there political powers in this country who really would be willing to put these hundreds of thousands on the ground that would be necessary and all the money that it would take?
Well, nobody's willing to do that. That's not a feasible option. The United States is not going to put ground troops in Iran. We don't have the money for it. China's not going to pay for us to do that. Really, Romney has been different from Obama in tone, but in terms of the actual policy that he's enunciated, he's largely just called for the United States to do what Obama is already doing in terms of covert action, in terms of sanctions, things like that. The difference is that Romney hasn't taken any sort of leadership on the issue of diplomacy and has basically used the fact that the president is engaging Iran as a tool against him in order to say that he is weak and an appeaser. The reality is we don't know if Romney would actually engage in those negotiations, but I think that's probably something that he should have to own up to. I would point out, though, that really what a Romney administration would look like depends on who he puts in various positions. And if you put a guy like John Bolton, who is currently one of his top foreign policy advisors, if you put him into the Secretary of State position or make him Defense Secretary, well, I think that he's been pretty clear that he does view military action against Iran yesterday as the best option. And so there is a good possibility that that's where we would end up. But without any willingness to engage in the diplomatic track, there's two options here. There's diplomacy and there's war. And in between there, you have containment. But this containment track is beginning to outlive its usefulness, I think. And we're getting to a point where we need to decide whether we're going to resolve this diplomatically or get into a situation where, we're not talking about an invasion. We're talking about a limited military strike, and then this idea of mowing the lawn. We strike them once, then 3 years later we strike them again once they reconstitute their program, and we just mow the lawn to keep them from getting a weapon. So I think that's potentially what we would be talking about when we say military action against Iran.
Okay, so this actually is more directed to you anyway. I'm going to read the question. You can say whether you agree with this the way it's phrased. How should American Jews decide who's right when Barak and, I guess this is David Barak, and Netanyahu seem intent on bombing Iran, while most Israeli military intelligence leaders, former and present, are against attacking Iran? And related question, are AIPAC's efforts a detriment to a solution to Iran or not?
Look, I think American Jews should decide for themselves. First of all, America has national interests that are in play here. It's an American foreign policy issue. So as Americans, American Jews should make up their own minds because it's a question of American foreign policy and national security. Secondly, even if you are looking at it through the lens of what's good for Israel, it's very clear that Israeli leaders are divided. The civilian leadership seems more open to the idea of military action and describes the threat in more existential terms. But we've had a remarkable series of people from Israel's intelligence services and military basically saying, directly contradicting the Israeli government on